Chapter 4 The Terrible Iroquois. In dealing with Indians, the French were infinitely superior to the English. For one thing, they cared little for land, and devoted themselves to the fur trade. The English were intent on carving out for themselves farms and building homes and cities in the New World. For another, the French adapted themselves easily to Indian customs, often married into Indian tribes, and treated the Indians as friends and equals. The English disliked and distrusted the red men. As a result, the French ranged the continent, La Salle down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, Radisson north to Hudson's Bay, Verendrye west as far as the Rocky Mountains and Wyoming, to mention only a few. The English long were held to the Atlantic coast, yet almost at the beginning of their relations with the Indians, the French made their one great and fatal mistake. On July 3, 1608, Samuel de Champlain, the father of Canada, founded the first French settlement at Quebec, and soon made an alliance with the neighboring Indian tribes. He had no idea of the gravity of the step he was taking. Those Indians happened to be Hurons and Algonquins, mortal enemies of the Iroquois, and by binding himself to them, Champlain committed France to a feud that in the end would do much to ruin her hopes in America. The following year, 1609, Champlain and two Frenchmen accompanied a party of Hurons up the Richelieu River, and discovered the beautiful lake that bears his name. On July 29th, near the present site of Ticonderoga, a band of hostile Indians, Iroquois, appeared and gave battle. The French men opened fire on the enemy with their arquebuses, very primitive muskets. 3 savages were cut down by their shots, and the smoke and noise of their guns. The first seen and heard in these wilds so astonished and terrified the hostiles that they scattered and fled. Champlain won a victory that day, but in a sense he lost a continent. The shot that brought down the first Iroquois brave started a sequence of events from which the French never were able entirely to retreat. Thereafter, like it or not, they were identified usually with the enemies of the Iroquois and suffered accordingly. The warrior race, thus alienated, was in many ways the most remarkable in America. Called the Five Nations then, the Iroquois were a league of kindred tribes, living in northern New York and ranging from the Hudson River to the Niagara country in the following order: from east to west: Mohawks, Onondagas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas. Later, about 1713, by the addition of the Tuscaroras, they became known as the Six Nations. They lived in long houses, dwellings of beams roofed with bark, sometimes 100 feet long and housing several families, in villages surrounded by strong long palisades. These towns were fairly permanent, for the Iroquois cultivated the land quite extensively. 2 native geniuses, Hiawatha, a Mohawk, but not the hero of Longfellow's poem, and Dakawenita, an Onondaga had formed the Iroquois League about 1570. It was a loose but smooth-working confederation, and one of its avowed purposes was to make war in order to make peace. Although the Iroquois never mustered more than 2,500 warriors, they were the deadliest and most feared war power of their race. Among the first of the tribes to obtain guns from Dutch traders, they extended their conquest until their dominion was acknowledged from the Ottawa River in Ontario to the Tennessee River in the south, and from the Kennebec in Maine to the Illinois River and Lake Michigan. Upon the allies of the French, Hurons, Algonquins, Illinois, and others, they fell with such fury that over the years they almost destroyed them, wrote Francis Parkman of the Iroquois. They made a solitude and called it peace. It was not by their craft, nor by their organization, that this handful of savages gained bloody supremacy. They carried all before them because they were animated throughout, as one man, by the same audacious pride and insatiable rage for conquest, and they owed their unity and vigor of action to the homicidal frenzy that urged them all alike. They and their Indian foes were sufficiently cruel and fierce in their tribal wars, but they seemed to reach an especial peak of ferocity when they became involved in the quarrels of white nations, to which the rivalry of France and England inevitably led. The French stimulated the Abenakis, Hurons, Ottawas, and others to massacre English colonies. The English used the Iroquois for the same purpose against the French. It was an ugly policy, a vicious policy, which made a hell of the border for most of a century. In 1680, the English colonies lay along the Atlantic coast, east of the Appalachian Mountains, but the French, besides claiming the St. Lawrence Basin and the Great Lakes area, and all to the north, asserted their right, though through exploration, to all of interior America. Their grand strategy became a long effort to outflank the English, coming in on them from the rear to conquer them. That master plan was in the end defeated by the dark and deadly Iroquois guarding the area below the Great Lakes. Jealousy over the fur trade caused the first fighting, though there was profound peace between Britain and France, and James II of England and Louis XIV of France on friendliest terms. In the distant wilderness of America, French forces cut off English trading expeditions on the lakes and captured English trading posts on Hudson's Bay in a series of sharp little battles. Those fights in the far north were like a fuse to a train of giant explosions. The English public in the colonies and at home was enraged, and the bad blood grew, even though King James ordered Governor Thomas Dongan of New York to keep a friendly correspondence with his rival, and take good care to give him no cause for complaint. In the summer of 1680, the Iroquois made a gigantic raid against the French allied tribes camped about Fort St. Louis on the Illinois River. They almost destroyed those villages, slaughtering hundreds, and, as Parkman wrote, returned with several hundred prisoners, of whom they burned those that were useless, and incorporated the young and strong into their own tribe. Governor Denonville of Canada resolved to punish them. His first act was to seize, treacherously, 51 friendly Iroquois, and ship them to France as galley slaves. The French used the outmoded galleys, rowed by slaves chained to the oars, as part of their navy in the Mediterranean until as late as 1748. Then Denonville mustered at Fort Frontenac, where Kingston, Ontario now stands, an army of nearly 1,000 men, soldiers, Canadian bushrangers and Indians, chiefly Hurons, Potawatomis, Sacs, Foxes, Chippewas, Ojibwas, and Ottawas. Young Baron de Lahontan, a junior officer, wrote of these Indian allies, "Never had Canada seen such a sight. Most of them wore nothing but horns on their heads, and the tails of beasts behind their backs. Their faces were painted red or green, with black or white spots. Their ears and noses were hung with ornaments of iron, and their naked bodies were daubed with the figures of various sorts of animals." Crossing the eastern arm of Lake Ontario with this motley array, Denonville began a slow march through the tangled forest. The Senecas, most westerly of the Five Nations, learned of the invasion and prepared. On a heated afternoon, July 13, 1687, while the French advance guard of 800 men pushed its way wearily through the marshes and heavy woods, there came a sudden uproar of gunfire, accompanied by blood-chilling war whoops. Men began to fall. A moment later, as painted savages bounded through the trees to tomahawk them, the advance guard went reeling back. The Senecas, greatly outnumbered, had neatly ambushed Denonville, and for a time they were near to winning a smashing victory. But the governor and his officers rallied their men. The French regulars and their Indian allies pressed forward. Firing grew heavier each minute, and the Senecas were gone as quickly as they came. They left 27 dead warriors on the field. Denonville's loss was about equal. He did not pursue, having discovered the perils of blind warfare in the tangled forest. When later he moved cautiously forward, he found the Seneca castle, fortified town, burned and abandoned. The tribe had gone to their neighbors, the Cayugas, to the east. Denonville could only retreat to Canada. The invasion infuriated the Iroquois. That winter, their war parties ranged through the French settlements like lynxes, keeping forts and settlements in virtual siege, and bringing trade and commerce to a standstill. It was not until the summer of 1689, however, that their real vengeance fell. In the midst of a violent hailstorm, the night of August 4th, a great war party of 1,500 braves paddled across the St. Lawrence and stole down on the settlement of La Chine, about 6 miles above Montreal. Suddenly, in the darkness rose the death yell, and the most terrible massacre in Canadian history began. Furious with bloodlust, the Iroquois burst into houses, looting, burning, and slaying men, women, and children without mercy. A terrified refugee managed to reach Montreal, and a detachment of troops marched to La Chine. Too late, they found every house burned and the bodies of settlers strewn among them or hanging from stakes. where they had been tortured. The soldiers retreated. Next day, a company of 80 men, marching toward Montreal, was cut to pieces by a horde of savages. Only 6 escaped death and scalping. Montreal was wild with terror. For weeks the Iroquois hung about, burning every house outside the city's ring of forts, looting and killing. More than 200 settlers died, and when the Iroquois departed, they carried away 120 captives, many to meet death by fire. Their own losses were almost nothing. While all Canada lay stunned by this disaster, news came that the English people had forced James II to abdicate his throne, placing William, Prince of Orange, and his wife Mary in the seat of power in his stead. Louis XIV of France backed the cause of James, and France and England declared war. It was the first of 4 wars in America, each related to a great European war. This one was called by the colonist King William's War, but in Europe it was the War of the Grand Alliance, 1689 through 97. It was followed by Queen Anne's War, War of the Spanish Succession, 1702 to 13, King George's War, War of the Austrian Succession, 1744 through 48, and the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, 1756 through 63. During all that time, there was scarcely a break in hostilities in the American colonies, for raiding, burning, and killing by the Indians went on even in the truces between these official conflicts. Denonville was replaced as governor of Canada by the Count de Frontenac, a great man and a veteran in administration of French-American colonies. He had once struck at the English colonies. Knowing his French were far outnumbered by the English, he fell back on Indian war parties, led by Frenchmen, and largely consisting of Hurons. Abnakis and Iroquois converted to the Catholic faith. These last had been persuaded by the Jesuits to move to Canada. Their pagan tribesmen proclaimed them traitors and called them Kaganagwagas. In the bloody times that followed, it was repeatedly seen that the Christianized Iroquois and Abenakis were as fiendishly cruel as the so-called heathen Indians. During the next fearful months, Dover, Solomon Falls, and Bristol in New Hampshire, Pemaquid and York in Maine, Schenectady in New York, and many other settlements in those colonies and Massachusetts were gutted, burned, and their residents murdered or driven north as prisoners by the Indians. Incredible as it seems, even after being warned, these places often were taken by surprise. For example, Schenectady, a Dutch settlement, left its fort gates opened, guarded only by 2 snowmen, built by boys as a prank. The night it was captured and its people massacred. One Indian raiding party penetrated as far south as Groton, Massachusetts, within a few miles of Boston, and returned safely to Canada after murdering 105 persons. All told, hundreds of English settlers were killed or transported to miserable captivity in the frigid north. Yet through all this agonizing period, the English settlers did not quail. Grimly they rebuilt their charred homes and towns, plowed again their fields, and fought back bravely, though at first not very successfully. There were some heroic deeds. In the spring of 1697, a band of Abenakis swooped on the farms in the vicinity of Haverhill, Massachusetts. One of those farms belonged to Thomas Dustin, whose wife Hannah had borne a child only a week before, and was resting with her infant under the care of a neighbor girl, Mary Neff. Dustin took his other 7 children with him when he went to work in his field. Frightful yells brought his heart to his throat, and he saw Indians assail his house, which soon was burning. At first he started to the rescue, but saw it was too late, and began to retreat with his children, the youngest only 2 years old, holding his gun ready and facing the now pursuing foe. Again and again the savages tried to come up to him, but the menacing musket kept them back. He had only 1 shot, but none of the Indians wanted to be the one who died by it, and so at last he succeeded in shepherding his little flock to safety in a fortified house that was well defended. Meanwhile the Indians, first brutally killing the poor little infant, herded Hannah Dustin and Mary Neff with others of the neighbors who had been captured. Those who were unable to travel were tomahawked at once. Then the survivors were parceled out among the Indians, who set out in separate bands for their villages far to the north. Miss Dustin, Mary Neff, and a young boy were given to a party of 12 Abenakis, in which were a squaw and her young son. On the way, the Indians terrified their captives with stories of the tortures they would suffer when their destination was reached. But Miss Dustin, as brave as any man, made a desperate plan to escape. She whispered it to Mary Neff and the boy, who agreed to help her. Halfway along their journey, the chance came. That night, the savages feasted, and feeling safe now from pursuit, they all went to sleep. In the still darkness, the prisoners stirred, rose silently, took up tomahawks, and crouched, each at the head of a warrior. It was a moment of supreme tension. They must miss no blows. They must kill all the men, or their own fate would be too terrible to think about. Miss Dustin gave the signal. Altogether they struck, and struck again and again about them, their arms steeled by fear and hate, with blows so rapid and deadly that the 10 warriors died almost before they roused from slumber. The squaw, bleeding, ran screeching into the forest with her child. Throughout the rest of that night, the 3 white prisoners hid, shivering at the thought that other Indians might come. But the great war party had scattered. At dawn, Hannah Dustin scalped the 10 dead warriors, and led the way home. They found a canoe on the bank of the Merrimack River, and using it, reached the Massachusetts settlements. She was, of course, overjoyed to find her husband and 7 children safe. With the scalps to prove their exploit, the 3 escaped prisoners were rewarded with many gifts by the colonial government and citizens, but their escape itself was surely the most precious gift of all. King William's War dragged on. The English home government did little to help the colonies. When the Treaty of Ryswick ended the war in Europe in 1697, it really settled nothing in the American colonies. There was, however, one important result. The Iroquois and the Maine Indians, notably the Abenakis, agreed to remain neutral henceforth, as between the French and English. This proved a great disadvantage for New England and New York, because in Queen Anne's War, which followed in 1702, the Iroquois kept their neutrality promise, while their enemies, and hence those of the English, did not. All of northern New England was burned and racked and blackened. Hardly a hamlet in that area escaped. Fine old towns like Groton, Lancaster, Exeter, Dover, Kittery, Casco, Kingston, York, Berwick, Wells, Winter Harbor, Amesbury, Marlborough, and others have dread chapters in their histories telling of the visits of the stealthy and murderous enemy. In a single month, August 1703, 160 persons were killed or carried off in Maine and New Hampshire. Most famous of those massacres was that of Deerfield, Massachusetts. On February 29, 1704, a leap year day, incidentally, the winter had been cold so severe, indeed, that though there had been warnings, the people could not believe Indians would come from a place as remote as Canada. Yet that February, 50 Canadians and 200 Abenakis and Chagawanaguagas stealthily filed on snowshoes nearly 300 miles to the settlements without being seen. Their leader was Hertel de Rouville. By the time they reached Deerfield, they had used up their provisions, and were wild and fierce with hunger. Snow lay deep on the ground, drifted up against the walls of the houses, scattered along the road toward Hatfield, and against the 8-foot wooden palisade, which surrounded the center of town. That night, the raiders lay hidden in the woods, while one by one the lights of the village went out, and families went to sleep. About 2 hours before dawn, leaving packs and snowshoes behind, they stole toward the doomed town. A crust had frozen on the snow, so hard that Indians and Canadians could mount the drifts to the top of the palisade and drop silently over inside the enclosure. Then the hideous sound of war whoops at the top of savage lungs awoke Deerfield to the horror that followed. With hatchets or log battering rams, the Indians smashed doors and window shutters, then leaped like beasts of prey into the houses to drag victims from their beds and tomahawk them or drive them out into the bitter night as captives. In the darkness, great bonfires sprang up, homes set in flames, with the skulking, crested figures of Indians outlined now and then in the glare. Shots, screams of victims, and the exultant yells of the savages made a hideous uproar in the night. The inmates of some houses fought. One house owned by Captain Sheldon was taken only when the Indians chopped a hole through the oak door with their hatchets and began shooting those within. That door of the old Indian house is today a prized exhibit in the Deerfield Historical Museum. Sergeant Benoni Stebbins and Captain Jonathan Wells also fought back in their homes. Particularly fierce was the attack on the Stebbins house. Inside were Stebbins, David Hoyt, Joseph Catlin, and Benjamin Church, named for the old hero, with 3 other men and some of their families. All told, there were 7 men, 4 or 5 women, and a number of children. Women loaded guns for their husbands, and Hoyt's wife was wounded in the battle. Stebbins was killed, and Church wounded, but though the Indians charged repeatedly and tried to set the house on fire, each attack was repelled, and the bodies of the painted foes, sprawled on the bloody snow, showed the price in lives the defenders exacted. Meantime, the alarm reached the nearby towns of Hatfield, Hadley, and Northampton, and armed men began hurrying toward Deerfield. Their rallying point was the Wells house, and with Captain Wells himself at their head, they began to pursue the war party, which drew off, cheated of capturing the Stebbins house, but bearing away many prisoners. A short distance from the town there was a brisk little fight with the enemy rear guard, in which both sides lost several men, but the invaders were too strong, and the rescuers were beaten off. 53 were killed in Deerfield, while the war party had 60 dead and many wounded. They carried off, however, 111 prisoners, including the Reverend John Williams, pastor of the village, his wife, and 5 of their children. Hardly half of the captives ever reached Canada. In the dreadful march through the frozen forest, Rouville hurried them forward at a pace many of the miserable prisoners could not maintain. These died or were killed, and among them was Miss Eunice Williams, wife of the minister. Later, after the war, some of the captives, including Reverend Williams, were exchanged for French prisoners, but many never again saw their homes. One was little Eunice Williams, aged 7, the pastor's daughter. She was kept by the Caughnawagas, grew up among them, and became the wife of an Indian, by whom she had several children. The agony of Deerfield was that of other towns, except that the English were ceded Acadia, Nova Scotia, which they had captured. Nothing was accomplished by the Treaty of Utrecht, signed in 1713, ending Queen Anne's War, and King George's War, which followed in 1744, was really no more than a preliminary to the savage and decisive French and Indian War beginning not long after. It was in this war that one of the world's towering figures, George Washington, made his first appearance in history. Chapter 5. Young Washington and General Braddock. The issue between Britain and France was too intense to continue long without an explosion of some kind. Each side had certain advantages and disadvantages in the life and death struggle that was building up. Along the Atlantic seaboard, the 13 English colonies by 1750 had a population of perhaps 2 million, while in Canada and Louisiana there were only about 80,000 Frenchmen, widely scattered. On the other hand, the English colonies were under separate governments, with so many jealousies and rivalries that they never acted as a unit. The French were under the single head of an absolute dictator, the King of France, moving and acting on orders without question or hesitation, while the English argued and let time pass. The French prepared. Imagine a gigantic scythe blade more than 2,000 miles long, sweeping from the Gulf of St. Lawrence up that river, across the lower Great Lakes, then curving down the Mississippi to its delta. That was the formation of the French fortifications. Louisbourg on Cape Breton, commanding the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, Quebec, Three Rivers, and Montreal on that great waterway itself, Frontenac, Toronto, and Niagara on Lake Ontario, Presque Isle on one end of Lake Erie, and Detroit on the Detroit River guarding the other end, Miami and St. Joseph covering the line to the lower tip of Lake Michigan, and from there hooking southward in a great sweep along the Mississippi Valley. Vincennes, Coquille, Chartres, Mosaic, Arkansas Post, St. Pierre, Roselle, Natchez, Baton Rouge, and finally New Orleans. Behind these crouched still other forts, the whole great system designed both as defensive and offensive points for the coming struggle. As usual, the French counted on their fierce Indian allies to make up for their own disadvantage in numbers. The first shot in the inevitable conflict, which was called in America the French and Indian War, was fired May 28, 1754, and the command was given by a youthful Virginia lieutenant, colonel then, only 22 years old. Voltaire, a great French essayist, said such was the complication of political interest, that a cannon shot fired in America could give the signal that set Europe in a blaze. To which Parkman added, "Not quite. It was not a cannon shot, but a volley from the hunting pieces of a few backwoodsmen, commanded by a Virginia youth, George Washington." In spite of his youth, Washington, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with steel-gray eyes and a handsome, serious face, had shown such promise as a soldier that he attracted the attention of Robert Dinwiddie, who governed Virginia. When Dinwiddie became concerned over the advances of the French into what he considered English territory, he chose the tall young officer as the best man to carry a message to the French. Thus it might be said that it was Dinwiddie who started Washington on his great career. Many years before, English representatives had made a treaty with the Iroquois, by which those Indians ceded all the Ohio Valley, which they claimed by right of conquest. By virtue of that treaty, England considered the area containing the present states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and parts of Illinois and Pennsylvania as English territory. Of course it was occupied chiefly by the Indian allies of the French, but not until the French began building forts in it did Dinwiddie take action. He dispatched Washington and a few companions with what amounted to a challenge and a threat to the French commandant of the newly built Fort Le Boeuf, demanding that he withdraw his forces. The commandant, Jacques Legardeur de St. Pierre, rejected the ultimatum, and Washington began the long and dangerous journey home. Twice he almost lost his life on the way, once when a treacherous Indian guide fired at him, the other time when a raft on which he and a companion were trying to cross the ice-choked Ohio River capsized, and the two of them narrowly escaped drowning and freezing to death afterward. For one night he stopped at a rude cabin owned by John Fraser, a trapper, at the mouth of Turtle Creek, where it flowed into the Monongahela River. A few miles below, the Monongahela itself merged with the Allegheny River. forming the Great Ohio. With the eye of a born soldier, young Washington saw how important the location was, and when he reached Virginia, recommended it as a site for the fort. His judgment was justified. The forks of the Ohio, where Pittsburgh now stands, became one of the great objectives in the war that followed. Dinwiddie sent a working party to erect a stockade there. Then, too late, he dispatched Washington, now a lieutenant colonel, with 2 companies of Virginia frontiersmen to guard them. The French had moved with speed. Finding the English fort being built, they drove off the working party, destroyed the crude stockade, and erected on the spot a strong fort of their own, which they named Duquesne after their commander. Washington, following as rapidly as possible, was still some distance from the scene when he met the working party in its retreat. He advanced, and at Great Meadows, near Uniontown, Pennsylvania, laid out a crude fort, on which his men set to work. Then, hearing that a party of French was lurking in the vicinity, he made a night march with 40 men, and just at dawn, May 28, 1754, surprised the enemy's camp. It was then that Washington gave the order to fire, the order which sent those first historic shots from the guns of his men. It was a brief little battle. Washington lost 1 killed and 2 wounded. The French, 10 killed and 21 captured, only one of them escaping to carry the news to Fort Duquesne. Among the dead was the French commander, the Sieur de Jumonville. Unhappily, Washington's first victory was quickly followed by his first defeat. As soon as Jumonville's fate was learned at Duquesne, a heavy force was sent hot foot after the Virginian. They found him and his men working on the fort he had previously started at Great Meadows, which he named Fort Necessity. There, after an all-day fight in a heavy rain against overwhelming odds, Washington for the first and last time surrendered to an enemy. He was to know defeat later, but never capitulation. On this occasion he was allowed to march out with his men and their arms. It was a dejected young officer who led his handful back to Virginia and reported 30 killed and 70 wounded in his brief campaign. Although the first effort to control the forks of the Ohio had failed, the attention of Britain's high command in London had been forcibly called to the importance of Washington's strategic choice. Despite the fact that Britain and France were nominally at peace, it was resolved to send a force of sufficient strength to capture the French fort there against any resistance the generals could imagine. The difficulty, as it turned out, was that the generals were short on imagination. On February 25, 1755, the ship of the line Centurion arrived at Hampton Roads, Virginia. It carried General Edward Braddock, a spit-and-polish soldier who had been commander of the famed Coldstream Guards. Later transports brought 2 regiments of British regulars, to which were added 2 regiments recruited in the colonies, totaling with the baggage and artillery trains 2,200 men, quite an army for the time and area, and in a period of supposed peace as well. With this force the British commander set out on a toilsome march toward Fort Duquesne. Much has been said in criticism of Braddock. He was scornful of the Virginia militia, in fact, of all colonials in general. But he was brave and recognized soldierly qualities. He at once offered Washington a position on his own staff, and Washington accepted. To transport his cannon and supply wagons through the miles of thickly grown forest, roughly along where today's U.S. Route 40 lies, Braddock was compelled to build a road. Though 600 men constantly felled trees and cleared the way ahead, for much of his march he averaged only 2 miles a day. It was June 18th before he reached Great Meadows. There he received a report that 500 French regulars were marching to reinforce Fort Duquesne. At that, Braddock took Washington's advice to leave the heavy baggage and march with a flying column of about 1,200 men, light artillery, and pack train. Though he was ill, Washington accompanied this advance. Thus far, although Indian scalping parties lurked in the woods to cut off stragglers from the column, there had been no real opposition. With supreme confidence, Braddock pushed on. He forded the Monongahela River on July 9th, only a few miles from the French fort, his troops in parade, marching order, a brave and splendid show, the regulars in red coats, the Virginians in blue, the irregulars in their hunting shirts, the bands playing. At Fort Duquesne, the French were almost in a panic. The commander, Contrecoeur, was about to abandon it and retreat, when a subordinate, young Chevalier de Beaujeu, begged to be allowed to make at least some effort to resist. Permission was granted, and Captain Beaujeu went to the Indians, camped closely around the fort, to seek warriors. He got them not only by his own persuasions, but through the influence of an Ottawa chief, about 35 years old, named Pontiac, who was to win bloody fame in history years later as the leader in the great Indian uprising called the Pontiac War. Barrels of gunpowder and musket balls were opened before the gates of the fort, and the savages helped themselves. Then Beaujeu set forth with 250 Frenchmen and 647 Indians, fewer than 900 men, mostly undisciplined savages, to meet the force of 1,200 British soldiers. Of the French, 50 were regulars, the rest bushrangers. About 2:30 in the afternoon, Colonel Thomas Gage, commanding Braddock's advance, saw those regulars directly ahead. A young man in a hunting shirt, but wearing the polished silver gorget of a French officer, was leading them. He was Beaujeu, for one splendid moment of glory, the central figure in the forest drama. Lifting his hat, he cried, "Vive le Roi! Long live the King!" and gave the order to fire. In the crash of French muskets, several English fell, but Gage was a stout fighter. The heavy answering volley of his men thundered out. Alas for brave Beaujeu! At this, the first moment of battle, he fell dead. Some of his men also were down. The French regulars gave ground, and the Canadian irregulars fled, but not the Indians. Slipping around the left of the British column, about 300 of them hid in a ravine, choked with timber on that side. Others occupied a low forested hill to the right, and the ground at its foot, every painted warrior in his own ambush. Captain M. Dumas, who took command at Beaujeu's death, rallied his soldiers, and with some of the Indians made a stand at the head of the British column. Braddock's light artillery wheeled into line and let go a thundering salvo that rose above the rattle of musketry. The British van halted. By now the woods were so filled with powder smoke that it was difficult to see. Up hurried the regulars in their brilliant red coats, bayonets flashing, men cheering. They swung into formation as they had been trained. As all European soldiers were trained, but close order formation was one they never should have taken. This was no warfare such as they had known, or the British generals in London could have imagined. It was forest fighting, and that day they learned a bitter, bloody, tragic lesson. For the first time, Braddock and his fine regulars were hearing that blood-curdling wolf howl, the Indian war-whoop. From both sides of the column it resounded, and the guns never ceased speaking as British soldiers fell. In the smoke of battle, which with the thick woods obscured everything, the troops could see nothing of their foes. Blindly they fired volleys at the trees, and they died bravely, as the British always die, but futilely, under the withering fire from the ravines and the hill. Vainly the excited Braddock tried to keep them in some kind of order, but in their confusion they huddled together like sheep, discharging their volleys wildly, and melting under the Indian sharp shooting. Knowing Indian habits, some of the Virginians ran ahead to the shelter of some fallen trees, to return the enemy's fire. Confused, and seeing the smoke of their guns, the badly rattled regulars shot into them, killing some 50 Virginians, their best fighters in this kind of battle. Washington strove to advise Braddock. The general would not listen. With magnificent courage but little judgment, he insisted on holding his men in their lines, exposed to a storm of lead to which they had no way of successfully replying, not until 5 hours had passed, in which he lost 63 of his 89 officers, and the ground was covered with the red uniforms of his slain men, did he at last order retreat. At this point, Washington was the only staff officer left on his feet. That day he had 2 horses shot from under him, and his clothing was riddled with musket balls. Yet he was unwounded. Demoralized, the British began a retreat, which presently became a rout, and then, with his men fleeing, Braddock fell, shot through the body, and dying. Washington and a Captain Stewart carried him after the army and across the river, where the pursuit mercifully ceased. Everything was lost: artillery, baggage, 25,000 pounds sterling in coin, all of Braddock's papers, and nearly 900 men. Only a few of the wounded escaped, the Indians killing any found living on the field. 12 captured British soldiers were driven back to Fort Duquesne and tortured to death under its walls while the French looked on. It was the Indians who won the victory, one of their greatest ever over white soldiers. The French, to be sure, were in the battle, but they themselves admitted the Indians fought on their own plan, cutting Braddock's army to pieces after all but a few of the French fled. The Indians suffered a loss of 60 warriors, mostly wounded, and the French 20 men, one of whom was the heroic young Chevalier de Beaujeu. Braddock died on the retreat home, and was buried near Washington's old Fort Necessity. The young Virginian himself carried official word to the governor of Virginia, telling of perhaps the worst disaster up to that time ever suffered by a British army. The French and Indians were to learn a lesson, too, that however gravely wounded was the British lion, it only returned more fiercely to the fray, colonies and mother country alike, until victory at last was won. The fire kindled on the American frontier spread. A year after Braddock's defeat, England formally went to war with France in the conflict known as the 7 Years' War, that brought well-drilled armies from both nations to America, for each recognized that this time the issue between them must be fought to the finish. Unprotected, the frontiers of Virginia and Pennsylvania suffered terribly after Braddock's defeat. The wild tribes of the Ohio country, encouraged by their stunning triumph, and aided now by the Delawares and Shawnees, who hitherto had been friendly to the English, made a waste of terror, destruction, and death on the border. Dumas, now commanding at Duquesne, boasted that through his dealings with the Indians, the enemy has lost far more since the battle than on the day of his defeat. And Washington left with a few hundred irregulars to the impossible task of guarding 700 miles of undefended frontier against swarming hordes of savages, wrote despairingly to the governor. The supplicating tears of the women and the moving petitions of the men melt me into such deadly sorrow that I do solemnly declare, if I know my own mind, I could offer myself a willing sacrifice to the butchering enemy, provided it would contribute to the people's ease. Meantime, a real military genius, the Marquis de Montcalm, took command of the French in America, and at once made his presence felt. In a lightning dash he captured and reduced to ashes the English fort and trading post at Oswego on Lake Ontario. Next he turned his attention to the great natural waterway between Canada and the colonial population centers, by way of the Richelieu River, Lake Champlain and George, and the Hudson River, a convenient way to move armies by water transportation. The French had forts at Crown Point and Ticonderoga, and the English had Fort William Henry at the southern end of Lake George. Ticonderoga long had been a starting point for scalping parties against the English, and futile efforts had been made to capture it. Now Montcalm took the initiative, with 6,000 soldiers and 1,600 Indians, part by land and part in bateaux, flat-bottomed boats and canoes. He started south on Lake George to attack Fort William Henry. Lieutenant Colonel Monro, a brave Scottish soldier, defended the fort for days against the attacks of besieging forces, many times greater than his, but at length, on August 9, 1757, he surrendered, on condition that his people be permitted to return safely home. On the next day, August 10th, when the garrison marched out, there occurred what many have called a blot on the career of Montcalm, although he probably could not have prevented it. As the soldiers, with their women and children, appeared, The Indian allies of the French fell suddenly on the column, and a sickening and brutal massacre followed. Montcalm and his officers tried, sometimes at the risk of their lives, to stop the slaughter. But they could do nothing with the blood-maddened savages. Nobody knows how many died, because hundreds were carried off as captives. Montcalm recovered about 400 of the prisoners, but at least 200 persons were never heard from again. After destroying Fort William Henry, Montcalm returned to Ticonderoga, where he later heavily defeated a British attack by the incapable General James Abercrombie in one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Meanwhile, General Jeffrey Amherst and General James Wolfe, who was as brilliant as Montcalm himself, partly restored the situation by capturing Louisburg, and thus obtained command of the mouth of the St. Lawrence. But these were operations of white armies, and we are concerned with the Indian phases of this war. The flag of France still floated over Duquesne. As long as it remained there, the American frontier was open to Indian raids, continually inspired by the French. A brilliant feat by an American officer suddenly changed the outlook of the war. On August 26, 1758, Lieutenant Colonel John Bradstreet, a New England man, with a force of provincials and Oneida warriors, crossed Lake Ontario in whaleboats, and during the night quietly surrounded Fort Frontenac. For once the French were completely surprised. They did not dream an enemy could penetrate so far, and so secretly, and in such force. The commander, Noyon, surrendered next morning, though the Oneidas begged Bradstreet to let them kill and scalp the prisoners, about 110 men. He sternly forbade it, showing far better control over his Indians than had Montcalm, and satisfied them with as much of the loot as they could carry. This bold, almost bloodless stroke was enormously important. Bradstreet captured 9 vessels, carrying from 8 to 18 guns, the entire French naval force on the lake. Huge quantities of provisions, munitions, and Indian goods intended to supply the western post fell into his hands, also 76 pieces of artillery. The cannon and all the supplies that could not be carried away were destroyed, the fort leveled to the ground, and the vessels, after first bearing the captured supplies and munitions to the mouth of the Oswego River, were burned. Loss of Frontenac was disastrous to the French. Some of their most valuable allies, Indian tribes, which had at first been inflamed by the victories at William Henry and Ticonderoga, deserted them. As they no longer received gifts to which they were accustomed, they now sensed the fall of France in America. Now, a new British expedition began, grimly toiling through the forest of Pennsylvania toward Fort Duquesne. Its commander was General John Forbes, a brave and canny soldier, who during this campaign was so sick that he had to be carried in a litter, and died shortly after. Yet he kept his forces doggedly progressing on a new road he was making, north of the old Braddock Track, near the present Pennsylvania Turnpike. A pair of fine officers commanded the 2 divisions of his army, Colonel George Washington and Colonel Henry Bouquet. The latter was a Swiss soldier of fortune, a veteran of European wars, and a loyal soldier of Britain, who had the sense to adapt himself to Indian tactics. Ligneris, now commandant at Duquesne, soon felt the pinch caused by the loss of Fort Frontenac. Not only did he lack goods to bribe the Indians to fight for him, but a heroic Moravian missionary, Christian Frederick Post, had done much to destroy French influence. A whole book could be written about Post's adventures alone. Unarmed, he went into the heart of the hostile Indian country, risking death by torture every day to persuade the tribes to peace. Not only did he have to talk to the savages in the face of their constant threats, but often he had to do so in the presence of French officers who urged the Indians to kill him, and even placed a large price on his life. All these dangers, however, he escaped, and his sincerity and calm reasoning, coupled with the staggering blow the French had suffered, brought about the neutrality of the Delawares, Shawnees, and the western tribes. Yet there was to be one more Indian victory. A rash officer of Forbes' army, Major James Grant, with 600 Highlanders and 150 provincials, began what he called a reconnaissance in force toward Duquesne. He got his force badly entangled in the forest, and on the morning of September 14th, the French garrison, with hundreds of Indian warriors, made a sudden onslaught from the woods about. The Highlanders were so confused that they fled, a thing almost unheard of in those fine fighting men. Fortunately, a company of Virginians, under Captain Bullitt, took a position on a hill, allowed the Highlanders to stream past them, then met the pursuing enemy in one of the hottest little engagements of the war. Of his 75 men, Bullitt lost 50 killed or wounded, but he stopped the foe. Grant and about 100 of his men were captured. 273 were killed and 42 wounded, but Bullitt saved the rest. The setback did not discourage the dogged Forbes. Once more his army moved forward, and now Ligneris knew the end was at hand. Camped 12 miles from the fort on the night of November 24th, the British heard the rumbling of explosions. Next day, advance parties found Duquesne blown up and burned, the French all gone. Washington, now 27 years old, led the detachment that entered what was left of the fort, and saw the English colors at last raised over the site of continental importance which he had selected as vital 5 years before. Grant's defeat was the last Indian victory in the French and Indian War. The following year, in September, Major Robert Rogers, commander of Rogers Rangers, in a brilliant raid during which he and his men underwent great hardships and suffering, destroyed the Indian town of St. Francis, gathering place of Abenaki and Caughnawaga raiders against the English, killed 200 Indians, and burned the village to the ground. Thereafter it was a matter of white armies engaging. Wolfe's historic storming of Quebec, when both he and the gallant Montcalm lost their lives, and the capture of Niagara and Montreal by Amherst. The fall of Fort Duquesne sealed those two events. By 1760, France had been ousted from Canada, and an expedition led by Rogers and his Rangers was taking over all the western forts about the Great Lakes. Out of this was to grow a new era of bloodshed, and the rise of another great war leader among the Indians.